Hey everybody, this is Pete Bartolozzi welcoming you to another class session, and we're continuing with the book of Exodus. And we ended class session with talking about what God said in chapter 9 through where he's speaking to Pharaoh, well, through Moses and Aaron, obviously. He said, for in very deed, for this cause have I raised you up, to show in you my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. And so we were addressing that. It makes it sound like God just raised him up to cause his fall, but that's not so much, the issue really here. And of course, I had recommended listening once again, the video Patterns of Evidence Exodus. If you haven't already, when that first came out, it didn't seem like there was as many people who heard of it, but a lot more and more have been hearing about this because of the succession of movies that they have brought out. So a lot of you probably already have. If not, I recommend watching it. And it brings out a lot of evidences to the time period in which the Exodus occurred, where all the archaeological evidence is that proves that they were there, and so on. But we showed how, God, being all-knowing. So he, in Joseph's time, God consolidated all the wealth and power of Egypt in the Pharaoh. And but God, foreseeing the future, that another dynasty again would turn against the Hebrews to enslave them and so on, and that he knew what it was going to take to release his people from that bondage when they would do so. And therefore, this is what this statement is about. When Israel took the wealth from Egypt, their once masters and so on, they literally took the wealth of Egypt, because the wealth was amassed in Joseph's time for them. So even though he blessed the Pharaoh in Joseph's time for honoring his servant Joseph and giving Israel the best of the land in Egypt, he foresaw what was going to take place in the future. And so he was preparing for the Exodus even way back then. So anyway, and then so we have that. So again, it says, for in very deed for this cause I've raised you up, for to show in you my power, and that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. Egypt was the world power of that day, at least in that biblical area of the earth. And you got to understand how phrase all the world and all the earth is used in biblical standing. It has to do with that area of the world. Basically, even the areas, Egypt was the most powerful nation at the time, so they were known throughout that area of the earth of Europe, Asia, Africa. They were very familiar with them, at least in this Middle Eastern area of Asia. They knew who they were. So when a world power falls, people know it. It's not, they're not just oblivious to it, and so on. And it was actually, and that particular perspective of that area of the world was the perspective that is in Scripture, because it was with the Jews who were in that area of the world. And so that's the biblical perspective that was held, and it was understood in that area of the world. Whoever's the world power in that Eurasia, African area, they were considered to control the world, even if they didn't actually fully control it. And that's sometimes what people misunderstand in the perspective that they had in this biblical area of the world. In order for us to properly understand when we hear phrases, all the earth and all the world and things like that, they're in end-time biblical prophecy. They're trying to interpret it the way we see it today instead of the way they understood it when all these things were written and so on. But I'm not going to get into that again. A lot of that is brought out when I taught Daniel and Revelation, and you'll find all those teachings online. And so when the Jews, Egypt was the world power of that day. Everyone knew of them. When they were brought down, the world knew it. So when the Jews finally, even, came late, 40 years later, to Canaan, the Canaanites were afraid of them because of what they had heard. I mean, it was only 40 years earlier, but for a nation to come down, that's still in the minds of people, which means that Egypt was so powerful and the devastation so great that the Canaanites were still in fear 40 years later. So God's name was known mightily in the earth of what he had done to Egypt for his people. So now we're of course, that statement is in this context of the plague of hail coming down. And so this hail is described in verse 24 this way, and says, and so there was hail, and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt, since it became a nation. Now, as I grew up hearing about the plague of hail, my mind automatically went to the only hail I was familiar with seeing, ice hail. In fact, we don't usually call it ice hail simply because that's all we know. And it's automatically understood that we're referring to the frozen water coming down in ball-shaped, of all different sizes, and what is technically called solid precipitation. However, I have never seen or heard of ice hail mingled with fire. Have you? Everything I have researched online about this only brings up what the Bible has said about it, because all secular articles are simply of solid precipitation. What is described here is similar to what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Obviously not on the same scale, since Egypt and his people weren't completely annihilated as Sodom and Gomorrah was. But it describes it as hail and fire mixed with hail, expressing that not every piece of hail was on fire, and could imply an ice hail and a fiery brimstone mixture. Ice hail being a counterbalance to the fiery brimstone, since this judgment was not meant to completely destroy again as Sodom and Gomorrah. So again, this would be a brimstone kind of hail, or a mixture of both. Brimstone is simply balls of burning sulfur. So even if it were just ice hail, large enough, it could still have caused the great damage and killing a living thing in the field. However, it is clear that this caused fire damage to buildings as well as to some crops and vegetations, as verse 31 states that the flax and the barley were smitten. It is interesting to note that God could be specific as to where this hail was focused as it hit Egypt, as it goes on to say that the wheat and the rye were not smitten. That's kind of interesting. The progression of these plagues starts with lesser intensity, even though as judgments they are not pleasant at all, even from the beginning. And as they continued, though, they increasingly became greater. With each plague, God wants them to repent and let his people go to avoid greater judgments. Even though Pharaoh was the one whose heart was hardened to the point of causing the judgments to increase, we can see how submitting to a bad leader can cause great harm to those who submit to them. In Proverbs chapter 29, verse 2, it states, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked bear rule, the people mourn, which means what? It's affecting the people. Even when David was in sin, the judgment that came caused many to die in Israel. Abuse of authority always violates those under that authority. Jesus was very strong against those who abuse their authority to control, manipulate the people. This is what brought out this is brought out in his dealings with the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Sadducees, who were both the religious authority and the local civil government as well. When he called them snakes and vipers, whitewashed sepulchres, and even children of eternal damnation. When he referred to them as bringing a proselyte in, he said, you make them twofold the child of hell than you are yourselves. Well, the Greek word is Gehenna in reference to the lake of fire, which again is eternal damnation. So in essence, he called them children of eternal damnation. When dealing with those in authority, Jesus' comments reveal his great disgust for those who abuse their authority to control, manipulate, and even keep people in bondage to them, and thus reveals the strong rebuke he has for them, because abuse of authority always violates those under that authority. Notice Jesus never rebuked the multitudes, no matter how much sin was no doubt among them, but only those who abused their authority did he rebuke so strongly and so sharply, because they violated the multitudes that he had compassion for. So, in this hail, time of the hail, as the fiery hail was predicted, God, in his righteous judgment, gave warning to the people of Egypt what would happen if they left their servants and livestock in the open field, thus instructing them to bring both servants and livestock under shelter. And the fact was recorded that those who heeded the warning saved their servants and livestock. And obviously, those who didn't lost both. Then, in verse 26, it states that only the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. Again, God takes care of his own, those in covenant with him. Besides this, God is, again, he's judging Egypt for their oppression of Israel. And God, once again, miraculously caused these things to fall on areas of Egypt where the Egyptians lived and not on areas of Egypt where Israel lived. There have been some who said that, again, and I've mentioned this before, who said the beginnings of the plagues affected Israel. But the evidence scripturally is that none of these plagues affected him. And so this is gross misunderstanding of Scripture, misunderstanding, obviously, of what they read, and not seeing the truth here that Israel was not affected. Pharaoh sent for them this time. It wasn't Moses and Aaron choosing when to approach Pharaoh as at the beginning, because he called for them. Dakes has this note in his Bible. He said, all the dealings of God with Pharaoh were efforts to soften his heart. And this would have been the result if he had not preferred to resist God and harden his heart instead. After seeing each miracle and the removal of each plague, he chose to resist further and continue hardening. So that brings us to the end of chapter 9, and so it brings us to chapter 10. The plagues are still continuing on. We're at the 8th plague at the beginning of this. And the next one is a rather long narration as well, because there's a lot of things going on here from verse 1 all the way down through verse 20. And this is the plague of the locust. So this would be against the sky gods, vegetation gods, their insect gods and stuff like that. And so those, and we see in this context. In fact, I want to go ahead and read some verses here. In verse 7 of chapter 10, it says, and Pharaoh's servants said unto him, how long shall this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go that they may serve the Lord their God. Don't you know yet that Egypt is destroyed? And then, of course, it's the next verse that says that Moses and Aaron were brought unto Pharaoh. So again, this is where it shows that they were summoned this time to come. And then, of course, the strength of this locust plague is brought out in verse 15. It says, for they covered the face of the whole earth, so that the land was darkened, and they did eat every herb of the land and all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. And there remained not any green thing in the trees or in the herb of the field through all the land of Egypt. And then, of course, to show you how he called for them, the next verse says, and Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste. So again, Pharaoh's servants, for the first time, I mean, not for the first time, but first they said, we can't duplicate this. This is the hand of God. And then here it says, how long will you let them be a snare to us? Let them go and serve their God. Don't you know yet that Egypt is destroyed? Those who serve Pharaoh were now trying to warn him and get him to stop yielding to his pride, telling him that Egypt is already destroyed. Why make things any worse? you know? And many believe that Egypt was a lush and fertile as the rest of Africa, not desert as much of it is today, except along the Nile, and may have become a desert because of the devastating effect of these plagues, as verse 15 again states, how it they the that the locust darkened the land. I mean, there was so many of them, it just darkened the landscape, and they ate every herb of the land, of the trees that the hail had left, and there remained not any green thing in trees, herb of the field, and throughout the land of Egypt. So here at the eighth plague, his advisors were ready to let them go, but Pharaoh's heart hardened and continued to take them further into judgment. In verse 8, it says that Moses and Aaron again were brought. So once again, and he called for them in haste because of what his advisors had said to him. That this had basically devastated the landscape of Egypt. There was no green thing. I mean, can you imagine the middle of the summer and all the lush green, beautiful trees and the fields and grasses, and it's just gone. It's just as barren as can be because no green thing left. And then that brings us to verse 21 of chapter 10. And now this is the plague of darkness. This is where things are beginning to wrap up. The land is already devastated, so there's no use of going any plagues further that direction. And so the darkness, of course, this would be their sun god Ra, who is like their supreme god that they worshipped. And so he's, it's intensifying. It's going up to their highest god that they worshipped. So in chapter 10, verse 21 on down through verse 29, we have this plague. And it is described as, in the first 21 right away, he stretched out his hand towards heaven that there may be darkness over all the land, even darkness that may be felt. Notice that statement, darkness that may be felt. And then it says Moses stretched forth his hand towards heaven and, of course, did what God just instructed. And there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. It says that they saw not one another, neither rose from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. And it continues to go on. This is interesting that light could shine upon Israel, or Israel have light, and not the Egyptians, when Israel was in Egypt. This is supernatural that God refused to allow light to shine in Egypt except the cities where the Jews lived. Verse 21, it spoke of it as darkness that could be felt, and thus speaks of an eerie, fearful, and even terrifying darkness. Verse 22 again goes on to describe it as a thick darkness. The Hebrew word for thick is another word that is also used of darkness. So the word for darkness is supported by another word that expresses darkness. Because the word for darkness can refer to a dusk or of obscure kind of darkness, where it is mostly dark, but enough light that you might be able to see a little as your eyes adjusted. But adding this second word as an adjective, it states that it was a dark darkness, or what we might call a pitch black darkness. The Hebrew word used as an adjective here translated thick, is used to express gloominess. And thus we have what we call a gloomy darkness. And it is also figuratively used in reference to wickedness. So we might call it a wicked darkness. So as we spoke of God's judgment in how, from God's perspective, he withdraws that which is sacred from. So when he removed light, what kind of darkness do you think came in? A divine darkness? I don't think so. Now, let me build further on what's going on in this pitch black, gloomy, eerie, wicked darkness by reading from an article I found several years ago entitled, What Happens During 48 Hours in a Pitch Black Bunker? And it starts as this. It was not just dark, it was pitch black. In these conditions, and I hope I can get through this in these minutes left, or otherwise I may have to finish it next class. But anyway, in these conditions, it would be impossible to see even the faintest hint of your hand were it inches from your eyes. And the silence is all encompassing. The only noise you can hear is the sound of your breathing, in and out, in and out. The sense of isolation is not just eerie, as if it had been cast into the furthest reaches of space, or as if you had been cast into the furthest reaches of space, or into the deepest subterranean cavern. Now, imagine staying in those conditions for hours on end, with no way to tell whether it was day or night. Would you pass the time asleep? Or if awake, would you stay alert in the absence of a single light and stimulus? Could any man, in fact, endure such total sensory deprivation without losing their sanity? This is what British scientists thought to discover in one of the most extreme and controversial experiences to be conducted on man's mind. They put a group of 6 volunteers into a total isolation chamber constructed in a former nuclear bunker in Hertfordshire, obviously this is England, to monitor the effects it would have on their mind and physical health over 48 hours. The researchers involved hoped to show or to shed new light on the validity of statements given by terror suspects who had been held in extreme conditions. It is important to look at the impact of sensory deprivation because of the number of places around the world that it is used as a weapon to aid in interrogation. Leading experts on the effects of psychological torture wanted to find out. We know that stimulating the brain helps increase connections in the brain that speeds up information processing. We just wanted to find out if the reverse occurs. The risks were considerable. Similar experiments carried out in the 50s by Canadian psychologists had to be abandoned after volunteers were unable to endure the condition for more than 48 hours. One subject described the sensory deprivation as being as bad as anything Hitler had ever done to any of his victims. Afterward, it reported that their very identity of his subjects had begun to disintegrate within 2 days. This is why sensory deprivation is still used as a means of extracting information from prisoners throughout the world, even though it's attacked by a lot of people for doing this. So, who's brave enough and foolish enough to undergo such an ordeal voluntarily? Stepped forward, comedian Adam Bloom, 37, one of the 6 human guinea pigs, who agreed to undergo solitary confinement in the bunker, and have his brain tested for the effects of it before and afterwards. For 2 days and 2 nights, he sat in total darkness and silence while the researchers were able to observe his behavior with night vision cameras. As with real-life prisoners of war, his only comfort was an occasional meal that was brought to him by his captors. I am a very busy person, with my mind always racing with thoughts and ideas, says Bloom. My job involves coming up with new jokes all the time, and I work by constantly observing my surroundings for anything I could use on stage. I reckoned 48 hours wasn't that long, and I was sure I could cope. And I'm going to skip some of this so that I don't read the whole article for time's sake. But I'm going to jump forward. And then 18 hours into the experiment, Bloom began to get increasingly paranoid. I felt as my emotions, at one point, I started singing and then burst into tears. I remembered the last time I cried, and I felt my emotions were beginning to run out of control. Then I found myself suspecting the whole experiment was a trick. How did I know that these people weren't who they really were and said who they were? What if they had gone home and I was trapped down here forever? I knew this was being ridiculous because setting up the experiment had taken months and involved lengthy meetings and emails, but I couldn't shake the sense of paranoia. By the time he had been in the bunker for 24 hours, Bloom's mental alertness was slowing down. Without light, it was almost impossible to stimulate myself, and my brain felt as though it was going to sleep. But his real troubles came 30 hours into the experiment. By then, he had taken to pacing the room endlessly as a bid to keep himself occupied. This behavior is often seen in animals as well as people when they are kept in confinement. It is a way of providing input into their physical lives. But after 40 hours, it took an even sinister turn. Bloom began to hallucinate. He saw piles of 500 oyster shells. He could see the pearly sheen on the oyster shells as clear as day, he said. Bloom says that I felt as though the room was taking off from underneath me, and for the first time I realized that the lack of stimulation was driving me close to insanity. I felt nothing but numbness, as though I was losing the will to live. I considered pulling out, but I told myself that at least I could comfort myself with the thought that my ordeal was soon going to be over. Some prisoners have had to endure these conditions for months and even years. Bloom was released after 48 hours to undergo psychological tests. The results were compared with identical tests he had carried out before his incarceration, and it showed a clear impairment of his ability to process information, a reduction in his memory, and, key point, an increase in suggestibility. And it goes on. There's some other things there, but I thought that was rather interesting to bring that point out. This article just speaks of 48 hours, 2 days, like in this state. But verse 22 states that the Egyptians were this way for 3 days, 72 hours. This darkness was clearly of such they couldn't even light their lamps, but were in total darkness, as verse 23 describes that they did not see one another, neither rose from his place for 3 days. And this further expresses a pitch black, not obscure darkness. You would think that they could at least light their lamps, but this clearly expresses that they could not. I don't know if humidity can get to the point of not being able to start a fire, light a match, whatever, but it is clear that something hindered the possibility of even starting a fire and having light in their dwelling. Because verse 23 ends by saying, but all the children of Israel had light in their dwelling, which means the Egyptians did not, expressing that they could not. And this pretty much brings us to the end of our time. I'm going to take up with a few more comments on this next time when we take up here with this class on Exodus. And until next time, be blessed, and thanks for listening in on this class session.